You ain't got no problem with me. I said, you ain't got no problem with me. Kind of freaking worthless too. There we go. You don't got no problem with me. I said, you don't got no problem. What either? All these pens, none of them work. Man, I am so not happy with that. But you won't stay up. Thank you. Good morning. Happy Halloween. Today is Sunday, October 31st. And I thank you for joining me. Obviously, I wasn't with you last week, and I missed having the opportunity to talk to you and share some thoughts on real estate. Hopefully, you feel the same way. Um, it's weird that it is October 31st. That officially means there are only 2 months left in the year in 2021. I remember when we started the year, we probably did you know what? So let me guess. We probably did a seminar that first, when would that have been? January the 9th, probably. And I've been at it almost every weekend since. And so, well, it's been an exciting year. Certainly, it's had its ups and downs, and as I'm sure we've all experienced some of the ups and downs of 2021. But it is very interesting and exciting to be here at the end of October, going into November, and to know that the year is kind of winding down. And it's a year that we can all look back on. I think years are valuable. Time breaks, the end of a month, the end of a year, even the end of a day. It's a shorter period, even the end of an hour sometimes. Uh, it's useful. It's valuable, right? It allows for a period of reflection and introspection. What did I do? What have I done? What have we accomplished, etc., etc. So I hope that we'll all look back on this year and think that we've grown and we've learned together, and hopefully we've taken some action to grow our own personal net worth, not only in terms of dollars and cents, but also in terms of our actual intellectual capital, right? What we know, the knowledge and experience that we bring to the table for future business ventures, future personal endeavors, and the like. Because those are, of course, the valuable things, right? If you're not growing, usually you're shrinking, right? You're dying, right? That's kind of how it goes in life, right? You're either resisting the forces of nature and growing against them, or you're slowly being defeated by them. And so hopefully each and every one of us is working towards being bigger, stronger, more capable individuals, groups, and teams as the year comes to a close. Um, this week, I was hoping to speak to you. Um, well, originally my plan was to talk to you about the obstacles, trials, tribulations, the difficulties that one can experience investing in real estate. And I'll talk about it a little bit. We've had some trouble recently at some of our properties that I want to touch on a little bit, just so that you're aware of it. Was that my phone? That shouldn't happen. But as I was preparing for this week's seminar, I actually came across a talk. And it was a good talk. It was a convincing talk, um, where I was persuaded that worrying about the future, how do I want to put this? I guess worrying, stressing, it's not quite the right word, but having anxiety about things that are coming in the future, or being anxious, or thinking too much about the future. I think it can be detrimental. I think it can be paralyzing. I'm not so sure that it's all that good for you. So I don't want to overemphasize the future or the things that can possibly go wrong. I'm going to talk about a couple, but I think really in life, there are problems. There are always problems in all of our lives, no matter who we are, no matter what we do. Um, Actually, I just finished watching that that Squid Game thing on Netflix, and for those of you who haven't seen it, who want to see it, I won't spoil anything for you. But on some level, that's what that show was about, right? That everybody had problems, regardless of where they came from socioeconomically, right? No matter what kind of money you have, we all face and experience difficulties, right? And in real estate, there's no difference. Uh, I think that in life, one thing that we often get wrong. I think one of the messages that I was taught, something that I maybe believed, and I think perhaps falsely, is that if you if you take action and you do the right things, quote unquote right things, then you will be spared from troubles in your life, right? That your life will go relatively smoothly. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. When you were a young person, maybe you were in school, right? They told you, hey, study hard, get good grades, go to university. So you have an easy life, right? And maybe some of you listened to that, maybe some of you didn't. And you know people who did. So some people listened, right? They went to university to go have an easier life, quote unquote, right? Because this is what they were told to do. And of course, they finished university and they found out life wasn't necessarily easier, right? That yeah, sure, maybe I make more money than the person who works at McDonald's, but life is still full of its challenges, right? And actually, a lot of people got a university education and found out that they couldn't afford a house in a city like Toronto, right? Things like that. So these things happen, right? And I'm not saying that education was necessarily the right or the wrong choice. I'm saying it's the popular notion that that's a good way to avoid troubles in your life, right? Unfortunately, you can't avoid troubles, right? So it's really just choosing what kind of troubles you want to have. And I think one of the beautiful things about real estate is you really get to choose your problems, right? If I'm a lawyer, take an example, and I work at a law firm, right? And you know what? One of our clients gets into legal trouble. Well, my priority is now figuring out their situation. That's now my problem and finding a solution to it. And if that takes a day, a week, a month of my life, that's the problem I'm now tackling as a lawyer, right? And this is apart from all of the troubles in my life, obviously, right? In the same way, right? If I'm a real estate investor, my problem might be getting a refinance through for my property, right? And as I'm trying to put together all of the bits and pieces to get my refinance together, whether that takes a week, a month, 3 months, right? This is the problem that I'm now faced with, right? And so really I can choose to be the lawyer who gets his problems chosen for him by his clients, or the doctor who gets their problems chosen for them by their patients, or the teacher who gets their problems chosen for them by the students' parents, right? Or I can choose to be a business owner, and really any kind of business owner, where I pick my problems, right? Now, I still have problems. In fact, I have more than the teacher, the doctor, or the lawyer, most likely, but I've at least chosen my problems, right? So, to give you an example, excuse me, real estate is my problem of choice, right? And we recently received notice from the city of Sudbury on one of our properties that they were going to stop garbage collection. You heard me correctly. They're going to stop collecting garbage from one of my properties. So this is a problem that we now have to deal with. So what happened? Well, garbage collection in Sudbury works just like it does here. It rotates through the week. They pick up garbage in different parts of the city. You have your day. You put your garbage out. They collect it. It's pretty straightforward thing. For reasons that are completely beyond me, the people who live in some of our units are mentally deficient or something. I don't know. And so they choose to put garbage out any day of the week because they're idiots. And even though they have been instructed not to do this by the property manager on multiple occasions, it is something that they have continued to do. The city of Sudbury is, for reasons I don't understand, other than maybe they're actually good at one of their jobs, really on top of the garbage collection. So they have by law enforcement people driving around checking if your property's got garbage on it. Now, our first strike was as a result of somebody who was a jerk. It was not our tenant's fault. Somebody in the neighborhood, well, I mean, it might have been, but we don't believe it was. Someone in the neighborhood basically drove through and dumped their old, I think it was car tires on our property the first time. And that got us our first strike because the 3 strikes are out kind of a system, right? So that got us our first strike, and obviously we got rid of the tires, whatever it cost us to dispose of them, and we moved on with our lives, back in business. Unfortunately, the second strike was the tenants leaving garbage out when they should not have, and the third strike, which we just recently received, was the tenants leaving garbage out when they were not supposed to. Okay, so now we have a problem to solve, obviously, right? We have an issue with the tenants, we have an issue with the garbage, and we need to figure them out. We have a couple of solutions, right? Some are good, some are not so good. So the first solution is we go sternly worded letters, and actually we don't, the property manager will do this. Sternly worded letters, pardon me, to all of the tenants. Hey guys, you're screwing this up. It's costing money, it's costing time, and frankly, you're going to have to live in a garbage dump if you can't comply with the city's garbage collection rules. Just as an aside, I don't even understand why this is my problem. Like, this should just be a problem for whoever lives there. I don't understand why, for even a second, they make this the landlord's problem. It's such a stupid situation because, like, if you live somewhere and you can't manage your garbage, then the city should tell you that you're in trouble. And don't come business with the person who's renting it to you. But anyways, so we're gonna try the sternly worded letters. We're gonna hope that that works. After sternly worded letters, we have to look at trying to get rid of whoever is the culprit, who's actually responsible, um, which is going to require uh, better surveillance of the property, probably the usage of cameras on the actual garbage collection location to actually monitor and make sure that the tenants are not doing anything stupid or counterproductive, right? And hopefully by implementing those changes, we can solve this problem. This is something that I don't think forget. I was gonna say I don't think anybody thinks of this before they get in the real estate investing. This is something I definitely did not think about as a problem prior to it becoming a problem. Right? I didn't even really consider garbage collection. Obviously, it exists. You have to pay for it. There are certain things that are required of you, but it never occurred to me that I would have tenants of such a unconcerned caliber that they would get themselves cut off from garbage collection. Like even the notion to me is a little crazy. But this is it, right? This is the problems that we chose. And so this is something that you should probably be mindful of and watch out for, right? As a real estate investor, even as someone who's looking at potential properties, right? Make sure the garbage collection area is easy to access, easy to clear, right? Or else your tenants might be stupid. And I can't show you a picture of the front of the property just because I don't have one handy at the moment. But if you see this property, like it's a straight shot. It's right out in front of the door. There's nothing complicated about getting the garbage out on time or removing it if it's not right. And yet somehow still have this problem. Right? So uh another pitfall that we've fallen into, something that happened on a different property, actually. Um, we renovated one of the units, so it's a triplex, and we renovated one of the units, brought it up to market standard, and we got a tenant, moved them in. They were happy, paying the higher, the rate after the after rental rate and everything, and everything was cooking. And after like a month or two, maybe three, our tenant received their electrical bill because it's separately metered, right? So they received their electrical bill, and it was really, really high. And so they contacted us about how high the bill was and asked if we would be willing to uh, include the hydro in their rent, right? Because they felt that it was really high. Which, first of all, weird request, right? If you say to me, "Hey, I know I'm renting your unit, but electricity is really expensive. Will you pay for it?" Why on earth would I ever say yes? Because obviously you use a lot of electricity. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for me to say yes after you've just told me you use a lot of electricity. But anyways, this happened. And so, we looked into it because, of course, why is your electrical bill so high? And they looked into it, of course, because they didn't want to pay such a high electrical bill. It turns out, and this is something that's important, probably important to check. Now, it's not the end of the world, but it's something that's important to check. It turns out that the way that property was wired was that, yes, the units are separately metered, but the previous owner, because they had lived in the primary unit, in unit one, they didn't bother to separate out the common elements from unit one. they just absorb the expense of those in their own electrical bill, which makes perfect sense, of course, right? They lived there, it was their expense, so they just ate it. The problem now, of course, is that that unit, which we had wanted to rent separately metered, carries all of the common elements. So it does incur additional expense that is not the tenant's responsibility, and that is my responsibility that I have to pay for. Um, and unfortunately, because of the way that it's metered, there's no way for me to separate out her expenses from my expenses, right? Uh, so we needed a solution. So we came up with a solution, spoke to the tenant, said, "Hey, look, understand you don't want to pay for electricity that you're not using. That's completely fair. It is my expense to pay for, and I don't have a problem paying for it. But I do need some time to figure it out. So in the meantime, we'll credit you the expense of the extra electricity that you use, right? We'll kind of work out what it should have been, and we'll pay you the difference. And in the meantime, we'll get to work with an electrician to get this situation solved once and for all." Reached out to an electrician, of course, get the situation solved once and for all. And unfortunately, the way the house is wired, the meters are inside the basement, which was completely fine when the house was wired, but is no longer completely fine because they changed the code. And I guess, who knows? Electrical meters, they have to be outside, fire safety or some shit. I don't know. So when we spoke to the utility, they told us no problem adding another meter, whatever. It'll cost you a couple $100 for the meter, and then an electrician a few $1,000s for his time, right? Okay, cool. Called the electrician. The electrician explained to us he'd have to move all of the boxes outside. So now we went from, hey, let's add a box for $2,500 to let's move 3 boxes and add a box for like $7,000, something. I don't actually remember what the number was, but something like that. It was quite a bit more expensive. This is not the cost that I wanted to incur, not the cost anybody wants to incur, right? Because if we're being real here, we're talking about $100 a month worth of electricity, maybe 150, maybe, right? So spending $7,000 to fix this problem doesn't make any sense, right? And I wish I could tell you, hey, here's the solution, but it's an ongoing problem. I haven't solved it yet. We don't have a solution in place. We were working hard to try to separately meter things. Obviously, that's kind of gone sideways. We might have to just include it in her rent at this point. We might have to give up and just include her utilities in her rent and call it a day, which is okay because, we bought the house right. The numbers are good. So it'll reduce our cash flow, but it's not going to bankrupt us to give her that money back, right? But these are the kinds of things, that the small minor things that you don't really think about, you don't realize going into it, that are speed bumps or hiccups, right? Another thing I want to talk about, this is not, I don't think, as minor of a thing, and this is something you should be more aware of, and this is also something that does not apply to the context of like a small multifamily in Sudbury or Cambridge or Kitchener or something like that, right? This is housing prices in the GTA. I want to talk a little bit about housing prices in the GTA because A, I think they affect probably all of us. B, some of you might be thinking about buying or selling property in the GTA right now. Certainly, if you own anything, it's a great time to sell. And if you don't own anything, then it might look like it's the last chance ever to buy. And, I feel those anxieties and pressures myself. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the GTA market. I live in an area where actually last year doing these seminars, I could probably pull up the recordings of some of them. I live in an area where properties were selling for around $1.1 to $1.2 million. I still live in that area, and the properties this year are selling for $1.6 to $1.7 million. That's been a very big jump in value. And you see that everywhere. I've looked across the city, and you see that jump in pretty much every neighborhood. I was looking at houses in what are traditionally less desirable neighborhoods, right? like Rexdale or Malton, where you're kind of close to the airport and the highways, and so people don't desire to live there quite as much. Even there, the prices have jumped approximately that much. So it's a citywide phenomenon, right? And it's just no surprise because this is a lot of the price jump is inflation related. That's what a lot of it is. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So there's a question, which is if a house was $1.2 million last year and it's $1.7 million this year, and let's say I couldn't afford $1.2 million last year, I still can't afford $1.7 million this year. If the trend continues, I'm sure as hell not going to be able to afford $2.2 million next year, right? And so you start thinking to yourself, or at least I start thinking to myself, well, maybe I should just bite the bullet and do whatever I can do to afford $1.75 million. So that way, at least when it's worth 2.2, I'll have made that 500 or $450,000 in the price appreciation, right? And I know people who don't know a damn thing about real estate, but who bought a house a couple years ago. And just because of their timing, they maybe took a house from an $800,000 valuation to say a $1.5 million valuation. Like they've made, pardon me, very good money. Now, it's not really good in the sense of like you can't deploy it for much because you have this house. You're not getting rid of the house. You need to live there. So you can refinance some of that money out of it. But, ultimately, it's not super productive money or anything. But all the same, they have that equity, right, in their hands. And they could, in theory, refinance and use it for something. So you start getting to I don't know, what do they call it? It's the FOMO, right? Fear of missing out, right? You start thinking, okay, well, let me just jump in there because obviously this trajectory, I mean, 1.7 to 2.2, and then the year after that, it's going to be 2.7. I mean, you start doing that math. It's like no matter how hard you save, even if you're really good and you listen to Aaron and you do 5 real estate deals next year, you may not be able to afford those houses, right? That is the mindset. That is the mentality of a bubble, right? You see, a bubble develops in the economy when people start thinking to themselves, I should have taken action yesterday. That's when a bubble develops, right? A bubble is based essentially on the fear of missing out, right? A bubble is based on the idea that had I taken this action 6 months ago, I would be advantaged. So I should take this action today, even though conditions may be different, right? And in the case of the real estate here in Canada, the prices will continue to increase at the pace that we've seen if the government continues to print money at the pace that we've seen. And if the Bank of Canada continues to do nothing about interest rates as they have been doing, right? As long as those conditions remain the same, the houses will continue to do what they've been doing. And it would not be a terrible idea if you can afford the $1.7 million to spend it because the property will be valued at 2.2 the next year, right? There's an economics term or claim there it's a Latin phrase. It's ceteris paribus. That means all things being even or all things being the same. And what do we know about life? All things are not the same, right? So things do change. I want to talk about what is going to happen in our economy, and especially as it pertains to real estate, as these institutions begin to meddle. And I want to be clear, I'm going to say begin to meddle. These institutions have been meddling from the beginning. In fact, the only reason our economy is the way that it is and looks the way that it does right now is because of these government institutions. But that's a bit of an aside. What's going to happen when they intervene in this particular situation this time right now? Well, the Bank of Canada has been holding interest rates artificially low, probably for 15 to 20 years. Definitely for the last decade, right? Since, what is it? It's 2021. So 07, that's 13, 14 years. So for 14, 15 years at a minimum, but probably going back almost 20. They've been holding interest rates low, okay? The side effect of low interest rates is cheap money. Cheap money means prices grow, inflation. So the Bank of Canada, which I hate that term, the Bank of Canada. It is not a bank. It is not of Canada, and it does not work for the government. The name is a complete lie, right? It actually, I mean, depending on how you define things, it is a government institution, but it also is not. You certainly have no ability to vote for the people who run it or what it does or anything like that. The Bank of Canada has held interest rates low, which makes money cheap. So the government has been borrowing the money. Okay. As long as interest rates are low and it is cheap to borrow money, then people can borrow more money, right? To use the real estate as an example, currently I run a lot of analyses at 2.5%, 3% interest, right? If I have, I don't know, 2% interest at 30% at 30-year amortization, I'm paying like $350 per month per $100,000. Okay. At 3.5% interest, I pay $500 per month, right? For $100,000. So you can see there, it's $150 more expensive to be at 3.5% than it is to be at 2.5% or 2%, right? And now that's per $100,000. So if I borrow $1 million, that's $1,500 per month more to be at 3.5% than to be at 2%, right? Pretty obvious, standard stuff, right? What that means in practice, right, is that as the interest rate goes up, the cost of anything that I have to borrow to buy also goes up. So, in an environment where interest rates are 2% and the average price of a home is $1 million, right? It is necessary mathematically that if that interest rate were to double to 4%, right? And therefore the cost of debt service were to double to 4%, right? Then the number of people who could qualify for that $1 million property would, in theory, be cut in half, right? Now, this has ramifications for the marketplace, of course, because if I cut in half the number of people who qualify for that loan, I cut in half the demand for the good or service being sold. And what do we understand about supply and demand, right? Obviously, if I cut the demand for something and the supply remains the same, the price must fall, right? Again, ceteris paribus, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, right? Because you come up with a counterpoint, right? But all things being equal, if I double the interest rates and nothing else changes, the prices must be cut in half because I will have fewer people who are able to buy, who are able to afford, right? And we have to be very mindful now if you want to buy into these types of situations because what the government is doing, the government is creating a debt trap, for lack of a better way to put it, where they're creating a situation where it is very enticing for people to accumulate debt because the debt is cheap. Oh, sure, I'll take $1 million mortgage for this house because it's going to be worth $400,000 more next year, right? It's perfectly logical, reasonable thing to think until the Bank of Canada changes the game on you. And once they increase interest rates, now you're going to have this house that you need to sell for $2 million in order to, break even or get out from underneath the house. But you'll be living in a world where no one around you can afford to borrow the money to pay you for that house. And now if you get into a situation where you must sell that house, right? If you have to divest for any reason and there's no one in the marketplace who can afford to pay you more than what you paid for it, you have to take the loss. Right? This is what happens. This is I'm being a bit granular about it, but this is the business cycle 101, right? This is just what happens. And so right now, there's a lot of rumblings in the media about the Bank of Canada raising interest rates. And it is something that if you're interested in buying a home, right? If you're interested in investing in the GTA, right? Really, it's those two things, then you should be paying very close attention, right? If you, pardon me, are investing out in Sudbury, in Kitchener, in Cambridge, down in Chatham or places like this, right? And you're following kind of all the guidelines that I've shown you in various seminars, right? The four streams and making sure you're buying properties that cash flow and all those things. Then rising interest rates, increased interest rate means it costs more to borrow money, and real estate investors are basically leveraging debt. So of course, rising interest rates are going to eat into your bottom line. Doesn't matter where you're investing. That's something that you have to be aware of. But if I have a property that cash flows, I don't know, $6,000 a year up in Sudbury, and interest rates increase a whole bunch, it might cut my cash flow in half. Maybe I'll go down to 3,000. Maybe it'll cut it into, by 2/3, and it'll go down to 2,000. Maybe it'll cut it by 1/6, then it'll go down to $1,000. But you can see it'll still be producing money, which means I won't have to sell it, which means I'm safe to wait until interest rates go back down and there's somebody who's willing to pay me more for my property, right? So this is a problem that is really most pronounced if your property does not produce cash flow, right? If it doesn't behave like an asset, then you could potentially have this problem, right? If it's more of a speculative asset. That's why I said the home. For most people, well, I guess for all people, really, your house where you live does not produce cash flow. You just live there, right? And so it can't ever float itself in those situations. So these are the kinds of properties that you have to be very aware of this with, right? When you go to purchase a property, say in the GTA, right, and you're going to borrow all this money into this kind of uncertain situation, you need to understand that it is in the government's interest. It's in the government's interest not to raise interest rates. They are very, very dependent on cheap, easily acquired loans. And they've borrowed so much money, especially this last year or two, that they can't afford. I mean, they really and truly, they can't afford for the interest rates to go up. That being said, the people who run our government don't know a damn thing about the economy. They really do not. I mean, the people running our federal government at this moment do not know a damn thing about the economy. Justin Trudeau does not understand Justin Trudeau is many, many things, but a man who understands the economy is not one of them, right? And unfortunately, he has a cabinet where he's more interested in having his cabinet look like it represents Canadians in terms of skin color and gender than having a cabinet that represents Canadians in terms of having intelligent people who understand what they're talking about things. And so we have certain people, not all, because some of the people I'm sure are wonderful people, although I'm not a big fan of government, regardless of whether you're good at your job or not. But some of them I'm sure are lovely people. But certainly the people in government at this moment are not people who think about the economy. They don't think that the economy is important. They understand they have to, pay lip service and whatever because, you got to get reelected and everything. But Justin Trudeau fundamentally and ultimately does not believe the economy matters, right? And he would tell you that right to his face. He doesn't believe that. And this isn't a political statement or anything. It's just who he is and what he is, right? And you need to understand that because it means that the decisions that he might choose to make, they might not make very much sense from an economic perspective, right? Like when you sit there and you just look at his decisions and you're only weighing the economics, you might go, no, there's no way I would make that decision, right? He may be making the decision for other reasons. So this is something that you need to be aware of because there's a saying in investing, and it originates from the stock market, but it's true across investment categories, and that is that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, right? And what that means is that if you have a cash position or an investment position, right, that is costing you money over time, you might, for example, make a bet that says, hey, you know what? Yes, the economy is going crazy right now, but in a year, they have to raise interest rates. They just have to, right? And you might make a bet on that. That takes a year to pay out. I guess that'd be some kind of derivative. And if at the end of that year it hasn't paid out, then you owe the money, right? There are lots of situations where you go bust before the economy turns around. To use a great example that you've all heard of, I think you're all probably familiar with, I believe his name is Michael Burry. He is The Big Short. If you've seen the movie or if you've read the book, The Big Short, he made a ton of money in 2007 shorting, I think it was the S&P 500 at the time. And basically he bet that the economy was going to collapse because there were all these bad debts and bad loans. And so he bet on it. So that we're clear, Michael Burry was like a month away from bankruptcy. when he hit his short. He had actually had to refinance his position multiple times. I think, if I remember correctly, they even show you in the movie. He had to refinance his position multiple times to the point where like he had to close his company, he had to let everybody go because the way that these shorts work, right, is like you pay money to maintain your position each month. When you're saying this thing's going to go down, well, you have to pay somebody to hold that bet for you, right? So it was costing him money to hold this shorting position. And of course, we all know the story. At the end of the day, he ended up you know, being right or hitting his number, whatever you want to call it, and he made a ton of money. But he almost went bankrupt because the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And in his case, he was just very, very fortunate that the market collapsed just before his finances did, because he was literally a month or two away from bankruptcy, right? And so that's something that's very important to understand, right? When you're looking at the economy, the market, and you're trying to analyze it and you're trying to understand what comes next. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying at the start in terms of like anxiety and worrying about the future. It's it's very difficult to predict. It's very hard to know. You need to be aware of certain things so that you fundamentally understand what kind of the parameters of the game are, where it's safe to tread and where it isn't, right? But ultimately predicting what is coming next is very, very difficult. And it's much better to think in bets, so to speak, and really find positions where you think your probability of success is greatest, and then to allocate your resources there. Which is why it's one of the reasons why I focus so much on cash flowing real estate, right? Um, Something where if you bet on that, right, regardless of what is going to happen in the future, whether you're accurate or inaccurate about what the government is going to do with interest rates or this and that and the next thing, well, those properties are going to be okay. They're going to be okay because they cash flow. And not only do they cash flow, but there's actually a very interesting sort of counter effect that happens in those types of properties that, compared to, say, what's going to happen to the houses in the GTA, right? So, pardon me, just to illustrate our example, right? So in the GTA, all the houses are now worth let's call it $1.2 million, average house price in the GTA. Interest rates double, and nobody can get a loan now. As it is, right? As it is right now, the government is talking about how young people cannot qualify for $1.5 million houses and that they need to do something to help them to qualify. How do you help people to qualify? They either have the money or they don't, right? Like the funny thing is that the government doesn't need to be involved in this at all. If you remove all the government regulation tomorrow, right? Do you think the bank is about to give $1.5 million to somebody who can't pay it back? Right? Of course they're not going to, right? So they're already willing to give you $1.5 million if you can afford to pay it back, right? And so the problem becomes, and this is where economies get very, very dangerous. Now the government wants to step in to fix a problem that they've created by inflating the prices beyond the point where people can off of the market and allowing builders to build houses and lenders to lend money. They're going to get more involved in the market. And now they're going to tell lenders to make riskier loans to young people who can't afford them so that those young people can get houses, which is ultimately, sooner or later, probably going to result in defaults, right? But that's neither here nor there. The interest rate goes up on these houses in the GTA, and now people can't afford to pay for them what the previous buyers were paying for them. And so now the last round of buyers have now paid more for these properties than they can be sold for, and they're stuck with them. This is fine. If you bought the house and you could afford it, and your life situation does not change as we enter this recessionary period or as we enter this high interest period, then you can continue to ride the wave, assuming your mortgage rate is fixed, right? Then you can continue to just sit there and pay, even though you may have overpaid for the property. You are fine. But what if your living situation changes? You lose your job. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you get a job somewhere else, right? Like maybe you get a transfer. They offer you a job in the States or in another province or in another city. All sorts of things happen. I don't know. Your kids get sick. You got to move, right? Like life happens. Your parents are not doing well. You got to go move with them, or maybe you need to move them in and this property doesn't have enough space or whatever, right? Things come up. You have to move. You have to change your life situation. But now you're in a property that isn't worth what you paid for it. Doesn't matter. You're I don't know, you got this job down in Florida. It's gonna pay you twice what your job's paying you right now. So you gotta go. So now you're gonna have to sell that house at a loss, which is this is exactly what happens. Right now, you're gonna have to sell that house at a loss. So you're gonna lose a bunch of money. Okay, well, let's go back in our example. You had a job, it was fine, everything was good. Nobody offered you a job in Florida, but you lost your job. So now you can't afford to live in this house anymore. You're not going to Florida, but you can't afford to live in this house anymore. You got to sell it at a loss, right? Let's just do a little bit of quick back of the napkin math here, right? So if I have, let's say, a $1.5 million house, right? That's that $1.5 million, okay? And I'm going to put a down payment, right? Because I have to buy this house. It's $300,000 down, 20%, right? So I'm going to put $300,000 in this property. Now, interest rates double, and people can no longer pay $1.5 million for this house. Let's say they can only pay $800,000 now. So $800,000 is what they can afford to pay you for the house. Okay. Now, $800,000 house has a $160,000 down payment. So in theory, you lost half your down payment because the value of this house dropped. Right? So boom, right away, $140,000 of your net worth gone. Right? So that's what the situation has done. So now you're down this $140,000 worth of net worth. Okay, well, that's bad. And you worked really hard to get the $300,000 to be able to afford the $1.5 million house, and now you don't have a job. So that nest egg is not going to improve anytime soon, right? So you're not going to be in a position to afford anything. Okay, that's bad. But you still need a place to live. You're not a homeless person, right? You're not a homeless person. You're just a person who's having a bit of crappy luck right now, and the economy is not being your friend. So you still need a place to live. So where are you going to move? Well, you can't afford houses. You don't even have a job. So you're not buying anything now. Maybe you could afford a condo. I don't know. It depends on your life situation, if you're married, whatever. But let's just imagine you're not buying anything now, right? You now have one option. You've now become a renter. And this is a very interesting dynamic about real estate investing, right? And this is the very interesting dynamic about owning these little multifamily properties, right? You've now become a renter. So now you had this person who was living in this big fancy $1.5 million house, whatever it was, and now they're broke. Part of it is their fault. I mean, they overextended themselves and whatever, but a lot of it is through no fault of their own, right? The economy being what it is, and most people not understanding half of the things I'm talking about right now, right? So now they find themselves in a position where they don't know what to do. They have to go live somewhere. They're going to rent. It turns out, unfortunately, that there are thousands of other people just like them who are victims of the economy, right? And all these people are now looking for a place to rent. And so we go back to our old friend, supply and demand. And even though the interest rates are up, right, and real estate should be something that is hurting because interest rates are up, well, there's now this influx of people who want to become tenants who didn't want to be tenants before, which means our supply of rental properties remains the same, but our demand for them increases. And so what do we know about supply and demand? The rent goes up, right? So when a recession happens, right, as the economy melts down and it displaces people from property that they had owned because they can't afford it due to interest rate pressure, those people are then forced out of the buyer's market and they're forced into the renter's market. And they come into the renter's market at the top of the market, right? They have more money than the existing renters do. So they come in from the top, right? And they push the prices up, right? And so the people who get hurt, and this is one of the things that I really find disgusting about modern politics because it doesn't get talked about, is the people who get hurt the most when these economic recessions happen is everybody kind of pushes down, and it's the people at the bottom, right? The poorest, the most vulnerable people, they get pushed out because they can't afford a place. And so you have a choice, right? You can have the deadbeat tenant who can afford $800 a month, or you can have the guy who he used to be some high flyer in Toronto, but for a year or two, he's going to need a place to rent. So he'll pay you $1,200, right? Obviously, this person who's paying you $800, they get displaced, right? And, you know, legally or illegally, I mean, the process happens differently depending on your situation and kind of the realities of the laws and the enforcement of where you are. But ultimately, over time, those poorer renters, they get pushed out, they get squeezed out, right? And they didn't do anything wrong, right? The reason they're being squeezed out is because you created a situation where people were lying about what things were worth, right? Specifically, the Bank of Canada was lying about what money is worth a year from now, right? Like the interest rate, which is something that doesn't get discussed very much. This is maybe something you've never heard in your life. The interest rate. What is the interest rate? The interest rate is the price of money. That's what it is. Just like you go to buy a house and the house costs $400,000, right? If you go to borrow money, the interest rate is how much does that money cost? And what the Bank of Canada and the government does, and that's why it's something that really bothers me to my core, because I just think it's wrong, is they distort what the interest rate is or what it should be, right? So in effect, what they do is they lie about it, right? And what that does is that causes Canadians or other people, investors, doesn't really matter, to make decisions based on their lie, right, about what the price is, that are then inefficient allocations of resources. And so they end up in the situation of that person who bought the house that they can't sell, right? Individuals would not make that choice if they were not being lied to and manipulated by the Bank of Canada. But that's what's going on. And the reason that it goes on is pretty straightforward, because people don't understand how this works, right? This might be the first time you're hearing this, or maybe you've heard it articulated in other ways, because there are certainly people who do not like the central banks. But in general, your average person does not understand how this works or why this happens. It's one of the reasons why, and full disclaimer, I have made lots of money and I do own these things, so I'm not promoting it, but just so you're aware of where I'm coming from. It's one of the reasons why cryptocurrency has done so well, right? Is because cryptocurrency, the goal of cryptocurrency is to try to eliminate the government or any institution's ability to manipulate the money the way that we see governments do in the modern world. And the hope, right? The dream is that one day, if you can get Bitcoin to replace dollars, as an example, which is a money supply that cannot be manipulated, then hopefully what that would mean is that poor people stop getting fleeced essentially by their governments, who steal from them using these very sophisticated economic techniques that they can't possibly understand or prepare themselves for. Fortunately, we're not poor people, or we sure as heck don't endeavor to be if we are in that bucket right now. Right. And so as you learn and you grow and you acquire your knowledge, you are preparing yourself to see these situations, be aware of them, and make the prudent decisions. Right. And the number one thing I think everybody needs to set themselves up for success, right, is we have to be very, very wary of how and why the government positions itself in terms of the Bank of Canada, interest rates, lending and borrowing, what that means for the market cycle, and what that means for trying to protect your wealth, right? And so right now, I would suggest it's a very bad time to buy, in the GTA. That's not to say you couldn't find things that would do well here. You probably can. I'm sure if you find anything that'll cash flow here, that'll probably do well. And there are definitely opportunities, but just be mindful of kind of the game that's being played in the background with the money. It's something that really, as an investor, you should not have to worry about. In fact, as an investor, in a perfect world, you'd be able to trust the interest rates. And so you'd be able to make all of your decisions based on what the interest rates tell you. Because you just go, oh, well, the interest rate is either trending up or it's trending down. It's going to do this, it's going to do that. I can kind of plan for the future. But unfortunately, right now, you can't do that, because even with the interest rates right now, like if you were to read an article about what the Bank of Canada is doing, the article won't even talk about the interest rates or the economy. It won't even care. It'll talk about the governors of the Bank of Canada as if these people matter or something, and what decisions they want to make in this very politically motivated process that is, inefficient to say the least, right? And so that's going to be the emphasis, right? So I don't want to sound doom and gloom or anything. This is a very negative thing. That is true. But it doesn't have to be negative for you, right? Like, it's something that if you understand and you leverage it, you can get ahead. And one of the things, this is my personal opinion, lots of people don't share it, but Warren Buffett, who is, widely regarded by many people as one of the great investors of our time, perhaps the greatest investor of all time, who knows, certainly is a very, very wealthy man. Warren Buffett made almost all of his money abusing this thing right here. and I say abusing, not taking advantage of, not being aware of. I think that if you are aware of and you take action to safeguard your wealth against the kind of predation of the government, if that's what you do, that's go you. Warren Buffett didn't do that. Warren Buffett set himself up in a position to be the predator and has been. That's how he's made his money. And if you look at a lot of the money that Warren Buffett has made, you will see that if you look at the chart, it coincides greatly with Richard Nixon taking the United States off of the gold standard. And the reason why it coincides with Richard Nixon taking the government off of the gold standard is because as soon as you did that, and when you weren't using gold as your money, you were using fiat, right, which is just dollar bills with nothing behind them, then that is when the government can start to manipulate the money supply. And once the government can start to manipulate the money supply, then you can position yourself, right, as an investor, as somebody who already has wealth, you can position yourself to get closer and closer and closer and closer to the spigot of money that the government is printing, which allows you to maximize your wealth, right? Because when a dollar is printed, it is worth $1. By the time that printed dollar has passed through 1,000 hands and moved through the economy, it's worth, let's say you're doubling the size of the economy, it's worth half $1, right? So that's something that people need to understand about the economy is that if I print money, right? So the theory says if I have a money supply, whatever, $1,000, and I double it to $2,000, I reduce the value of each dollar by half, which is true. This is what the math tells us. This is exactly what happens. That does work. Go ask some Venezuelans. They'll tell you. The problem is that in the real world is not an idealized mathematical model, right? And so this doesn't all happen at once. In fact, the first person to get those printed dollars can spend it as if no money was printed, as if it still had its value prior to being printed, right? And so if you can position yourself as a business or an entity that is near the money being printed, then you can maximize the value. And Warren Buffett went after that greatly by investing in financial institutions like insurance. This is one of the reasons why he owns so many insurance companies. It's because insurance companies like banks are incredibly close to the money printing. And so he gets first dibs on money, right? Essentially. And that is one of the many strategies he's used to get ahead. And I'm not here to say Warren Buffett's a bad guy or anything. I mean, he's smart. He took advantage of a situation that, you know what, he'd probably prefer that this weren't the situation. But if this is going to be the situation, he's going to make the money he can make, right? And I'm sure for you as well, like for me as well, I absolutely despise that our government does this. Like I said, I think it hurts people. And it's not me. It doesn't, I mean, it does hurt me because it hurts everybody. But you know what? At the end of the day, like I'm not going without food because the government is messing around with interest rates. But there are people who are. And that's it's horrible and it's wrong, right? And I mean, what are you gonna do, right? What are you gonna do? But be aware, right? Be aware of these things and plan accordingly. Um, and remember, you know, there's a horizon on all of our actions, right? If you're on a boat, you're in a car, you're walking, whatever. There's the horizon, right? You can only see what you can see, right? And you know, I'm gonna use a soccer field as an example because I spent a lot of time on a soccer field when I was a kid. If you're on a soccer field, I mean, the whole soccer field fits within your horizon, so you can see everything within that soccer field. So the horizon doesn't necessarily apply to the soccer fields per se, but when you're on that field and you're looking around, you can see the horizon. You don't worry about what's beyond the horizon, right? Like at some point, you know, hey, there could be things on, you know, outside the horizon that you may need to worry about one day. That they could be consequential, but ultimately, you can only see what you can see. And investing is it's very important that we remember that mentality, that mindset. Um, I can only worry about what's in front of me, you know, within reason. I mean, I can think about other things and I can abstract and I can this and I can that, but worrying too much, it's not actually all that beneficial, right? I should focus on right now making the best investment decisions that I can make, trying to allocate my resources as best as I can, knowing that yes, in 6 months, a year, things may or will change. Um, but that if I'm making good decisions today, then 6 months from now they should still be good decisions. And like I said, you know what? We're all dealing with emergencies, problems, whatever you want to call them, crises. It's just a matter of what kind of problems you pick, right? So I don't want you to take from this seminar that, oh, you know, there's doom and gloom and bad things are coming. There is doom and gloom, and bad things are coming, but there's always doom and gloom. Bad things are always coming, right? If you don't believe me, just ask an old man who's at the end of his life, right? The end is nigh for somebody always, right? This is unfortunately this is life, right? And the end will be nigh for us as well one day. But for now, we got to build as best as we can to have good, comfortable, happy, ambitious lives. Um, and so as long as we focus kind of on that short term, making good choices short term, if they're good choices, then they will remain good choices in the longer term, right? And ultimately, we can't overthink the future, especially when you have a situation like the one that we have where you can't just do the math and figure out what's going to happen, because what's going to happen is going to depend on the choices of people, right? And certainly if you look at history, the choices that people have historically made, usually this situation just gets worse. That's what usually happens in history. Usually throughout societies in the past, when you've allowed people to print money with zero accountability, they destroy the economy. That's what's happened to every single civilization up until now. Every single one of them. And now we're doing the exact same thing, and it's probably what will happen to us, right? But that could take hundreds of years, right? That might not affect your life. It's just something to be aware of. And like I said, hopefully, we have something that no civilization really had before, in that we have these cryptocurrency people who are working very hard to try and find a way to cut the government out of the money. And maybe they'll succeed, right? And certainly, you know, um, if you make some money and then you turn it into gold, then you don't have to worry about the government inflating it, right? If you make some money, you turn it into real estate, you don't have to worry about the government inflating it, right? So just be aware of kind of the dirty tricks that are being played, and set yourself up in a position where those tricks don't work on you. And maybe even do your best to help inform other people and make sure that they're aware of what the government does and what's going to happen, so that they also position themselves. And then ultimately just do what you can, right? Like I was telling you before, you're going to see rents increase as affordability decreases, right? So the more you can position yourself to be in a position to increase those rents, the better you're going to do in those correctionary time periods, right? And not only will you do better, right, financially, but you got to remember you're helping people. I mean, can you imagine if you're a person, you don't understand anything, nothing that I've just said in this seminar, you've just been living your life and you bought a house, and now your house is not worth what you paid for it, and you lose your job, and now you lose a bunch of money, and now you're down $100,000 or whatever, and you don't know where you're gonna live. And then you reach out, and here's Aaron, and he can rent you a unit. And yeah, it's not what you wanted out of life, it's not where you were hoping to be this year, but it's something, it's a lifeline, it's somewhere for you to stop the fall and start rebuilding your life. You're doing good things for people. So be in a position to take care of yourself and hopefully to take care of others, and life will reward you. It almost always does. I'm gonna call it here. If anyone has any questions, now's the time. Otherwise, I thank you so much for your time. Go ahead, Dylan. So I don't want to have 2 minutes left, but I see the GTA as it was never for Canadians. Like due to globalization, I was at a party yesterday, and this condo, two-bedroom condo, was owned by a property management company based out of Ohio. Yep. I see the GTA open up as an international hub where a flood of international money is coming. It was never meant for the Canadians here, which then that would bode well for almost a boom, or a secondary boom. It was a very local one. These low, I won't say low level, but entry level buyers would buy their own homes. They take equity out of their own homes, and now these investors are seeing Toronto as a big international hub. And I see the GDP almost. Like, Justin Trudeau may not understand everything, but he knows Canada's buying power. And a lot of that stuff stems from real estate. So if he keeps interest rates low, buyers come, real estate affects our GDP, and Canada has more buying power because we don't do anything else. We don't manufacture. We don't have movie. That is such a good point. You are right on the money, Dylan. I hope that we will get the opportunity to talk about that some more next week. Okay.